Okay, that's fine.
So
Can you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, hi everyone. Lynn has kindly given us the venue and the idea to do a presentation of our safari to Northern Zambia to those interested parties. It's being recorded, and I need to emphasize at the start that this is the fun parts of the trip. I'm not really intending to make a detailed display of butterflies because Jeremy will cover that in the next version of African Butterfly News, and also he will be doing a presentation to our conference in September. So let's just first introduce us. On the bottom picture from left to right is Peter Ward, followed by Colin Congdon, Jeremy Dobson, Ian Bampton, and Steve Collins. The real idea of the trip came from Ian, and at this particular venue, we've got Steve, who's peering into camera on the inset. We've got myself doing the talking at present, and we've got Colin sitting further over that way. Jeremy is away on another trip to pacify his better half after having spent 5 weeks in Zambia. And Ian hasn't returned with his trailer to Johannesburg yet. He's still in Harare with friends. As you can see, right up at the northern part of DRC comes the Western Great Rift Valley, and that lake up there that comes down into the top part of northern Zambia is actually where our northernmost point on the trip was. So we'll move on. It's not going forward. How do I advance?
Move to the screen.
There were several weeks of planning going into the trip, which included meeting with Martin Dunderstedt and Chris Fick, who both have some extensive experience of collecting in Zambia. At that stage, Colin and Steve had not joined us, but at the table is Martin, from the left is Martin Dunderstedt, Chris Fick, and myself, Peter Ward, Ian Bampton, and Jeremy Dobson. Now, one of the sort of happy sad things is that Chris Fick is currently very ill, and we wanted to get the input from him while we could, but he is so sharp in his memory, right down to which tree you must turn left at. It is quite amazing. And then moving to the next slide.
Right page down.
I know you want to make the center of it. No, you can't do that.
Okay. Now, the route I'm going to cover is just the route in for the time being, because we used different routes coming back. Basically, both parties in two different vehicles, with Ian carrying a trailer, left from Johannesburg. On day one, we went through the Stockport border into Botswana to Seruli and stayed at the Majestic Hotel, which, though very comfortable, didn't have much to recommend it. Day two, we went to Elephant Sands and spent the night at Elephant Sands. Day three, we crossed the border from Elephant Sands going north, just close to Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, where we spent the night. On day four, we traveled to Lusaka, spending 2 nights there, so that we had a day to shop for provisions and also a opportunity to go and visit one of our sponsor members in Kafui. So on day 6, we went up to Fika Lodge, which, for anybody who knows the area, used to be called Forest Lodge, and spent the night. And day 7, we went to Mutanondo Wilderness Reserve, which is where the collecting really was going to begin. And we spent 4 nights there, giving ourselves 3 days at Mutanondo. Then on day 11, we had a pure travel day up to Mporokoza, where we spent the night in a basic but comfortable and value for money hotel before embarking on day 12 to what was one of the more difficult days of the journey, which was 170 kilometers, which took 7 hours to complete to get to Ndoli Bay, which, as you can see on the map, is the northernmost point not only of our trip but also of Zambia. Next slide, please. No, that one down. This is the one which gets you to the next slide.
No, it's not doing it.
Right, we set off on the 9th of April, and our two vehicles rendezvoused just outside of Nylstroom after starting off in the pouring rain from Johannesburg. Picture left is Ian, expedition leader, Steve Collins, Jeremy Dobson, and Colin Congdon. Picture on the right is just one to include me. You know the other people already. Next slide. Elephant Sands, Botswana was exactly that. It was very sandy and it had a lot of elephants. And in the process of trying to take a selfie of Steve and myself, it looks like I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder called an elephant. But it was a very comfortable place. Next slide, please. From Elephant Sands, we went up across the border at a very seldom used crossing called Pandamatenga, which meant that we didn't have any of the massive queues that one sometimes has at many African borders. So it was a relatively easy day, stopping along the way to see what butterflies there were. Not an awful lot to report. Refer to Jeremy's ABN newsletter, which will come out at the end of July or at the beginning of July. And we had a very comfortable night, except for the fact that we noticed a little notice in the shallows saying, "We apologize for the inconvenience, but we seem to have a plague of mosquitoes." And I've seldom seen anything like it. And Jeremy drew the short straw and ended up in a bed under a mosquito net without a fan. But the mosquitoes had got into the net before he did, and he had a really bad night. Next slide. You can see in the background the Victoria Falls as we crossed over the border into Zambia at Vic Falls. We then spent the 2 nights at a hotel in the middle of Lusaka so that we could provision up. We obviously couldn't provision beforehand due to restrictions of what meats you can transport across the border and so on. And once the shopping was done in the morning, Steve Collins, myself, and Jeremy took the opportunity to backtrack a little bit to Kafui to meet up with Anthony Kambitsis, who is and has been a sponsor member of LepSoc for some time. He's also, as you can see in the picture, very keen in his hybridization of impala lilies. Fascinating guy. He was from Zimbabwe and had to move during independence. He had a collection of Zimbabwean butterflies, which is now in the Livingston Museum. And once he got to Kafui, he started collecting again. So we had a fascinating time looking at his collection. Our next stage took us to Fika Lodge, which is actually a lovely lodge near where Stephen Pishi. Mkushi. And it's actually set in a nice bit of Brachystegia woodland itself. But it was only an overnight stop. We managed to arrive early afternoon, so there was time to have a look around and find a few butterflies, but not really time to do too much more collecting. Next slide. Our next stop, which was to be for 3 days with 4 nights, was Mutinondo Conservancy. This is a lovely piece of unspoiled wilderness. As you can see from the pictures, the picture on the left is taken from just outside the little bar that they have at Mutinondo, where we obviously spent a bit of time. And the other one is just one of the sort of collecting areas as you go along the tracks. It was an interesting place to collect. Unfortunately, the weather was not fantastic. they'd just come out of something like 6 weeks of almost solid drizzle and rain, and it hadn't really cleared up yet. So we were finding the weather a little chilly and wearing jerseys a little bit more than we would have liked to. There was also the issue that about 2 weeks previously, um, they'd had a problem with lions. Now, lions are always around the camp in Mutinonda, but on this particular occasion, a couple of guests had gone up to a little koppie next to the camp where you can apparently get cell phone signal. And while they were there, they were worried about some threatening noises from some lions. So they sent a ranger up to go and have a look. He'd no sooner got there than two young male lions charged him from different directions, obviously looking to attack. He was lucky enough to get a shot off, which wounded one and scared the other one away. According to our hostess, Larry, when they went to go and view the spot afterwards, you could see the skid marks where the lions had come to an abrupt halt after the loud bang of the shot. They had also planned to have they called it a 50-50 mountain bike race, which was fully booked the following week. They would do a 50-kilometer loop one day and a 50-kilometer loop another period, another day. They'd bought all the provisions and had to cancel it because it just wasn't safe to have 200 odd cyclists on the road with rogue lions around. So that sets the scene for, what became a little bit of a nervous day part of the time, because we could hear those lions roaring at dusk, and they were right next to the camp, and we could hear them roaring again in the morning as the dawn broke, and made us a little twitchy, to say the least. And Larry said she didn't want us going to certain areas without armed guide with us for our own security. Next slide. This is a picture on the left. Sitting in the corner, you can see Larry. The other five of us have been introduced already. And just a beautiful sunset shot taken from the bar on one evening. Next slide, please. There. On the left is Colin on top of a koppie. We were looking for some aliena and the such like. But as you can see, this was probably about 10 o'clock in the morning. Colin is still wearing a jersey, and it's overcast, so it wasn't the greatest weather. The middle shot is of one of our armed guides who accompanied us when we wanted to go hiking and looking for butterflies in certain areas. And on the right is Jeremy, sucking down some morning coffee and getting ready for a day's hiking. Next shot, please. Jeremy, who seems to be able to cover huge amounts of ground in a day, see some really nice butterflies. There were patches when it warmed up, and we all saw some butterflies, but Jeremy kicked the rest out, I think, out of the bush, and is marching around and climbing koppies. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, because that's really the subject of Jeremy's next ABN newsletter, and we don't want to spoil his thunder. In any case, this was more about the trip than the butterflies. Okay, and after we left Mutinonda, then we were sad to leave Mutinonda because we absolutely loved it there. We stopped off at Katemwe Lodge, which was a pretty basic lodge, but cheap enough, and was a convenient stopping off point before the next stage of our trip to Ndoli Bay, Lake Tanganyika. The head of Lake Tanganyika as we drove in, nearly 7 hours after setting off, and the road was so bad that the 170 kilometers took us 7 hours, and managed to break the chassis completely on Ian's off-road trailer. It's interesting to note that the road doesn't look bad there, but further back, there's no ways I could have taken a picture with all the jolting going on. And beyond the headland in that picture is the DRC. So we'd finally made our northernmost point, Ndoli Bay Lodge on Lake Tanganyika, which happens to be the longest freshwater lake in the world. It's also in places 2 kilometers deep, which if you work it out means that the bottom of the lake is about 500 meters below sea level. So it's quite a large body of water. It was also at a record high. They said the lake had gone up 4.5 meters since December, and was currently sitting at about 50 millimeters higher than the highest ever recorded height, which was back in about 1960. What used to be in front on the left-hand picture was a nice beach, which stopped us short of that floating platform. But that wasn't there anymore. But we had to take the picture to celebrate the fact that we'd made our northernmost point, even if there was some damage to the trailer, and some of us were getting a little bit fed up of being bumped around on rather uncomfortable roads. Next, they have a lovely camping site right on the beach, but that's the camping site on the left, under about 2 meters of water, and apparently the best fishing spot in the lodge at the moment. So there was no chance we could camp. The lodge owners were very understanding and said, look, you didn't come all this way just to turn around and go back. They basically gave us something resembling camping fees for the use of 3 lodges, and Jeremy set up tent in front of 2 of the lodges, so at least one of us camped. But it was such a beautiful spot, unbelievable. Next slide. But now the reality of the vehicle problems became apparent. On a day out to try and find somewhere along the road to collect, bearing in mind that we couldn't collect a lot of the areas other than in the lodge because it is part of the Nsumu National Park, most of it. We suddenly heard the thunk, thunk, thunk and realized, whoops, we have a problem. And Jeremy's tires that particular tire had established a sidewall tear which was barely repairable. We did in fact manage to get it in, I think the next day, into the little town of Nsumu, where Steve and Jeremy, who were with the vehicle at the time, had to actually give the repairman an advance to go and buy a razor blade so that he could cut some inner tires to patch up the tire from the inside. But I don't think any of us had any faith in that vehicle lasting more than 100, or that tire lasting more than 100 kilometers if ever we needed it. What was even more worrying was that his right front tire had a big bulge on it like a hernia, also from hitting some of those potholes on that 170 kilometers. And meanwhile, back at the camp, it had taken Ian a couple of days to get the trailer offloaded, and then with the help of WhatsApp messages to and from the trailer supplier, figured out how to undo all the bits and bobs and the electrics and the fridges and the water tanks and everything else that needed to be got off the trailer. And we'd had the bright idea that we needed a block and tackle, which fortunately the lodge had, to lift that huge box off. And once we lifted the box off, we realized it wasn't just a stress fracture, but the chassis had actually, it's a Y shape with 2 sidebars, and both sidebars had cracked right through and separated from each other. The only thing that was holding that trailer together was the stainless steel box on top of it.
What make of trailer is that? I just want to avoid that.
It's called an everlasting trailer. Yeah.
The steel box is
broken. Yeah, and when we realized that, we realized there was a real problem. But fortunately, in these out-of-the-way places, you've got on your staff, like at the lodge, there was a welder. So we thought at least we can get it welded, which was fine. But once we got the trailer off, the box winched up, and were able to start welding at about 3 in the afternoon. It just welded one side when load shedding hit. Zambia has up to 11 hours at a time load shedding. So there wasn't, the generator they had was too small to run the welding machine, so we had to delay. But then there was a swimming relay for charity in aid of raising funds for Nsumu National Park. And just so happened that the welder was also the chief boatman. So the next day he had to spend preparing the boats to go and support the swimmers. So load shedding or not, we couldn't do anything the next day. The day afterwards he had to be on the boats supporting the swimmers. So we couldn't do anything on that day. And the day after that, his responsibility was to get the boats safely under cover and back on their trailers. So we were only able to start in the afternoon. Fortunately, that afternoon, load shedding didn't hit and they managed to finish the welding job. And then it took another day or so to get all the bits and bobs back on the trailer, and another probably 2 days in total before we were happy and all the electrics were connected and everything was working again. Then another day to reload, because Ian carries plenty of stuff in that trailer. But anyway, that's life. And as I said to the guys, if we had to break down somewhere, there's probably nowhere better on this trip to break down than in Dolly Bay Lodge. It's like a 5-star beach resort, so it was wonderful. Next slide. The chassis revealed on the 26th of April and reassembled and ready for loading on the 30th of April. Next slide, please. So how did we fill in all this dreadful time while we were waiting for the trailer to be repaired?
Tough time.
Yeah, it was tough. It was really tough. So we do things like watching the sunrise as the fishing fleet returned home from a night of kapenta and other fishing. And there was a spot of rain the one afternoon, and after that Jeremy and Steve decided to swim out to the floating platform, which is actually quite fun, except for the hippos that are croaking about 30 meters away. You're only allowed to swim between the hours of 8:30 and 4, because apparently the crocs and hippos leave you alone during those hours, but be that as it may. But as you can see, Steve was so bored with all the sitting around and not being able to travel, he developed a peg leg in that shot. Next slide, please. Also, while waiting for the trailer repair, we were able to observe certainly the end of the 21-kilometer sponsored relay swim for Nsumu National Park. And interestingly, it was one South African girl who wasn't planning to swim the whole distance who actually swam the whole distance. Everybody else just swam half an hour at a time in their slot in the relay. Next. So while waiting for the trailer repair, Steve and Jeremy and I found a dusty collecting spot, but the big advantage was, although it was about 27 kilometers from Ndoli Bay Lodge, which meant they weren't the worst 27 kilometers, fortunately, but there were flowers, and the flowers initially were fresh when we first started collecting there, and we really had fun there. But about 3 days in, the flowers were getting a bit tired and the butterflies were getting a bit bored, and we were getting tired of the same patch of road. But nonetheless, we persevered because there wasn't much other choice. Meanwhile, back at the camp, Colin was assisting Ian with all the trailer repair work. He was literally being Ian's skivvy and passing him what he needed and getting him drinks and giving him moral support. I don't think it would have got repaired without your support, Colin, to be quite honest. Just to whet the appetites again, another ensemble of some of Jeremy's photos. The Zambezi skipper on the left, a very interesting aliena in the middle, of which Steve managed to catch one, I managed to catch one, and Jeremy managed to catch one, so there was no serious quibbling. Elena Zambiziak Nyasa on the right, Papilia Lomieri bottom left, and Steve, that is a Kriya? Eltringhami. And then one of the forms of Danaeus crassippus, which we're not particularly familiar with here, Stiripus, is it?
Doropus. African monarch.
Yeah, it's an African monarch, yeah. Okay. With the trailer finally ready to leave, we spent a farewell day cruising on the lake. The pictures show us leaving the lodge at 7:30 a.m., stopping at a kapenta rig to get some bait for fishing we were planning to do later. And then the person in front, in the middle picture, is actually Kobe Ludik, who is one of our newest recruits to LepSoc. He was keen on butterflies before. He's now a fully fledged member of LepSoc, and he was instrumental with the manual work of helping Ian get that trailer sorted out. Really a fantastic guy. He's the manager at the lodge. On the right, the tree at the back is a tamarind tree, and it's on top of one of the largest freshwater dunes in the world. And also, that particular site is the site of Kenneth Kaunda's private lodge. Next slide. Yeah. The lodge was finally abandoned in 2015. We never did manage to find out quite why it was abandoned. And the main house is not visible. All you could see is the rafters sticking out of the water because of the height of the lake. Um, and below were some of the guest accommodations and a beautiful, intricately carved bar. Next slide. Fishing. Colin caught the first fish. We caught a few more, but apparently the people who'd gone fishing the day before had caught all the fish in the lake because we battled to catch a few more. Maybe it's just we're better with our nets than with a fishing line. And then we stopped on a secluded beach, and you can see Colin and Ian sitting on the bench in the shade of a beautiful spreading fig tree, while Kobe and his captain on the boat cooked the fish we'd caught, which we ate for lunch, which was really special. That 170-kilometer hell road to spend the night at Mporokoza again, and then the next day headed to Kapisha Hot Springs. The pictures below show the approach to Kapisha. It's really lovely. You can see the grassland in front and the Brachystegia woodland covering the hills. And the lodge itself overlooks, I think it's the Mukushi River or something. But it's really is a beautiful spot there. We spent a day at Kapisha Hot Springs. Unfortunately, the weather was overcast and coolish. But Jeremy still disappeared at 9 o'clock in the morning and came back at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with these pictures. The rest of us who wandered around hopefully didn't see nearly as much as he did, but it was still good and it was a really great place to be. The other nice thing about it is that Larry, our hostess from Mutinondo, actually happened to be there as well. So it was now like a reunion. So it was really great fun. So photo in celebration of Chris Fick. Chris, who'd helped us with the planning, had on different occasions there during his collecting days met the owner, Mark Harvey, who's in the right of the picture, and Jeremy and Ian at this spot on different occasions, all of them taking a weight off and getting a good, nice hot spring bath in the evening after a day's hiking. The owners are mad about animals. They had something like 17 dogs and I don't know how many cats. And I think that sign really meant it. The one on the left that said all guests must be approved by the pets. It was really fun. Then we traveled back to Fika Lodge for 2 nights. The reason for 2 nights was to allow a day exploring North Waka Conservancy after a connection Steve had made during our first stay at Fika Lodge in the Mkushi area. The 2 pictures are just a picture, it's beautiful, it's unspoiled Brachystegia woodland, it's never been hacked into, it's never been tried to be farmed, it really is as nature intended it. And we stopped at a little waterfall and made that our base from which to tramp around. And what you can see in the picture is the lilac tree nymph, which I think most people in South Africa, it's probably the top of their bucket list because everybody fixates on it. And then what is the English name of that lighter, Steve? Do you know?
Oh, no, Zadaki.
Zadaki.
I don't know
The Ephedra zadaki, which is also something which gets the blood racing of most Southern African collectors. End of our joint safari, as we separated after Fika, Jeremy and Peter needed to be back in RSA by 12th of May, and Ian, Colin and Steve were to proceed to northwest Zambia and do the western leg, which Jeremy and I had hoped to participate in, but unfortunately the trailer problems meant that we didn't have time to do the west. But Ian is a great provider. Ian brings the most amazing things out of that trailer. I mean, all the treats and specialities that you'd think you'd only get at a 5-star lodge suddenly come out of some dark recess of that trailer. And he'd saved a bottle of real champagne to mark the event, and say cheerio at the splitting of the group. Next one, please. Jeremy and Peter went down then and spent a night with Ant Kambitzis again in Kafui, before crossing to Zimbabwe via Kariba and spending 2 nights with one of our Zimbabwean collectors and LepSoc members, Jono, Francis, and Harari. It was a really great time, but basically from south of Lusaka downwards, the country had been through an extremely severe drought, and a lot of it was a bit like a desert. And Zimbabwe apparently had the same problem. Jono took us to a couple of places where we were dead certs to catch things that both Jeremy and I wanted on our list. And the one, a little nondescript Orochrysopsis, is it, or Euchrysops, we managed to get a couple of those, but the rest not. But nonetheless, it was nice catching up with Jono and seeing some of the things he has in his collection, and he and his wife were really good hosts. After crossing the RSA at Bite Bridge is not bad on the way out. You don't want to do it on the way in. Apparently, you can spend up to 3 hours trying to get through that border post.
But you can also do it in 10 minutes if you're lucky.
If you're lucky. But on the way out, it tends to be a lot easier because all they've got to do is stamp your passport now.
Yeah, we went through very quick.
If you can wake them up on the South African side long enough, you get through fast. The Zimbabwean side was an absolute amazing experience for an African border post. They have signposts up telling you what order you've got to go to who in. Everything is computerized. Once they've captured your passport on the first one, it's just a case of a couple of seconds at each next counter, get the relevant stamps, and you through. It was amazing. The South African side was embarrassing, even in a third world country. It was quite awful. But nonetheless, we managed to do it in 40 minutes. And then we stopped at a B&B just before Louis-Tricard. And it's very conveniently situated for a possible future LepSoc outing, because it's within easy reach of doing day trips to the Great Salt Pan, to Intabeni, to even Lekalametsi or Gundani forests. Yeah, a great place to take possibly beginners, but also dry. When we drove back via the Vivo Road, where you should be able to find lilac tips. The only thing we saw was one little orange tip the whole way. It is devastated. It's like absolute desert up there. Doesn't look like this here because this is on the escarpment and you get those morning mists rolling down. But they've got good accommodation. Lynn and I will talk about that at some other time. And we arrived home on Sunday the 12th of May, nearly 5 weeks on the road, and over 7,000 dusty kilometers, but some wonderful memories and some wonderful company under our belt. Even Colin to give updates on their trip to northwest Zambia with Ian, who is still in Zimbabwe as we speak. Steve.
Thank you. Okay, so we were actually going to try and go across from Ndoli Bay through the lakes to the Congo border, but the roads were so bad, and with the trailer situation, we decided to come back to Fika and then go over to the corner of northwest Zambia to a place called Ikalengi and Winilunga. And the next slides, if you please. Fika Lodge, it's a jolly long way to go. It's about 1,500 kilometers, something like that. It's a very long way. So we went to Chingola, which is Larry, the lady you heard at Mutinondo's sister. And they lived on a farm, and we were given the parents' house to use. And this is the type of Mashitu that you see, which is Brachystegia woodland. But it was pretty nice. But when we arrived there, we wanted to do our clearance. So in Zambia, they only give you 1 month's entry. And so we had to go and get an extension. So we got our extension in Mukushi just before Fika, but the next time we had to go and get an extension for the insurance and for the car, so to get the customs clearance, which they did in Chingola, and uncoupling the trailer from the truck, they found that the bolts in the truck that were pulling the trailer, which normally have 8 bolts, were reduced to 1.5. So we could have had the trailer separate from the vehicle. That would have been a total disaster. So the next thing, of course, was Ian needed to repair the back of the truck. And they went into Chingola, managed to get some parts, also managed to get the clearance, which gave me the time to go into the forest there, which was lovely. So we spent 2 nights in their parents' house, the old house. Moved on to Wina wa Nzambi, which means the eye of God. And so it's a sinkhole, probably, with a rim around it. And they had some, they said, accommodation, chalets, and also a great tenting site, which both Ian and Colin had used before. However, when we got there, there was no food and it was self-catering, but it was still pretty nice. So then we spent a day there and moved on the next. The guy who'd run the lodge at Wina wa Nzambi was a Christian missionary, and they'd spent 20 years ago 2 months going down the Lunda River all the way down to Livingston to Victoria Falls in canoes. They'd gone down in canoes, which was quite an experience. So then, when we were at Lunda, at Wina wa Nzambi, the guy said, "Oh, well, look at this insects," because he was interested, and he brought out a picture. He brought up this flower mantis nymph, the one on the left there, and it was still around a couple of days later. And then on the right was a clump of butterflies, and it's difficult to see, but there's a praying mantis actually eating the butterflies. So the wings there, so the praying mantis is standing over the butterflies and munching away at them. It's quite difficult to see without enlarging it, and there's another better picture of it. But anyway, thanks. So finally we had arrived at Hillwood Farm, which is a very famous, Nchila Lodge, which is a very famous place, which for the last 30 years and many trips that Colin has done, and Ivan and Ian, was the place to go and stay. So here is the campsite at Hillwood, and you can see Ian's trailer transforms into this huge campsite on the right, and there is the truck as we're unloading it. And the next site, no, it's not here, I see. So unfortunately, when we'd unloaded the truck and established everything, Colin and I said, well, it's pretty itchy. We found that there was a huge infestation of pepper ticks, which was a disaster. So the campsite we'd infested, had moved in, because they hadn't been burning the grass, was full of pepper ticks. So I think we have literally thousands of bites. Okay, so we're now on the road to the Angolan border, and eventually we got to the Zambian side, and they wouldn't let us go down to the bridge to this piece of forest. But the picture previously was showing the Zambezi River, and Colin tells us that from previous times there was lots of lovely forest on the side of that river, but it had been taken away, whether it was washed away or what. There were trees dead in the middle of the river, so it may be, but basically I never did get to see the Angolan border, but we did see the source of, and we're trying to get in. But what you see there on the right-hand side and the left is this Hyperrhenia grass, which is very common this time of year. And in a month or so's time, they will burn that. Every year they burn it. And then you can walk through the vegetation. But that stuff, as it stands now, is impenetrable. So some of the trails that we wanted to go and look at, it's just impossible to get to because of the grass was so big. But as you can see, it's not for the faint-hearted. And to have put the trailer down that road, thank goodness we didn't. It was just unbelievable. If it was 7 hours for 170 kilometers, when I was moving down that track, I was probably doing 10 kilometers an hour. Thank you. So unfortunately, in Africa, the only snake is a dead snake, is a good snake, is a dead snake. So we met this lady called Esther Townsend, who had been the teacher at an orphanage for 40 years. She's retired now, but she was the sort of person who helped us with the contacts. So when we couldn't really do any insect collecting at Hillwood because of the pepper ticks, We then went down to Sakeji School, which Chris Fick had recommended as well, and spoke to the headmaster, and he let us go into their forest patches. And there's a picture of Esther with a particular snake that unfortunately had fallen out of the tree. But if you look at the butterfly net in size, you can see it was sort of 7 or 8 feet. I mean, it probably was a harmless snake by the looking at the jaws, but I haven't got an identification on it. Yes. So unfortunately, Murphy's Law, bad luck. Ian said, "Oh, the tire pressure's going down," and he'd caught a stone in the tires, and the tires were in good shape, but this stone had managed to cut through the tire wall, so he put some dope in it. In the meantime, the village was there. I think there were 30-something people, Colin?
Oh, at least.
30 people sitting around trying to say, could they help? But actually, what they were really saying was, could we help ourselves to... So we were sort of hawkeyes trying to manage the thing. And actually, when they Ian eventually got the tyre on, and we still was short of pressure, we moved on a couple of kilometres and stopped. And then we just stopping to put pressure in, and we could open up the trailer to get the bits and pieces that we required. What was interesting is that there were roadkills of butterflies on the side of the road. So while Ian was with the compressor was putting pressure in, I was walking up and down the roadside picking up dead butterflies, which happens every single day. And what people don't understand is that we as insect collectors are spending time on it, but there are far more roadkills of insects, as you used to see all the splatting on your screen, than we as insect collectors could ever collect. So that was actually quite an important thing to see.
And that ant-heap.
And look at the termite mound behind, and there was sort of there were places where people could sit, and it's very common that you'll get because of the aeration, a tree growing out, and that was one because it's beside the road, but it's extremely common in northwest Zambia, depending on the soil types. Those are the termite mounds. And Peter said, when we were at one of the previous places in Mutanondo, what are those great big lumps? And actually, they are termite mounds, but you wouldn't realize it. So they must be hundreds of, not thousands of years old. Thank you. And then we're on our way out, and now we've actually left Zambia. We've gone through back to Chingola and through to Lusaka, and we got through the border at Kariba. There was so we said to Ian, "What about it?" And there was a lovely baobab to stop by, and that was the last final meal before we got down to Lusaka. And then from Lusaka, we drove down to Harare, and that was 7,000 kilometers plus, because unfortunately, when they did the welding of the car, he had to turn off all the electrics, and they lost all the data from that, but it was 7,000 kilometers plus. We don't know. So it was quite a haul. And so I think that's pretty much all. Is there any more slides?
No, that's it.
End of the slides there. Okay, thank you very much. So that was the fun. So that was, we had another, 2 weeks, Colin, after these guys left?
Yep.
So that was a total of seven weeks, and sadly, Ian had to see friends in Harare. Time ran out, so we came back down to South Africa, where we are now, and we go back up to Kenya next week, just before you have your election, and so there we are. So, sorry, Lawrence, you've just missed the slideshow, but hi. So.
Are you recording? So just, yeah. Grab a chair.